Here is Rob Chiles, who's a lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Maryland, and he spoke in our Gilded Age series last year. Rob did an outstanding job, and that's the reason he's back this year. But anyway, he is interesting. He's a Renaissance person. He, as an undergraduate, majored in music and played the cello. Now, how many historians could ever make that kind of claim? I graduated from Towson State University and then went on and received a PhD from the University of Maryland. He's published scholarly articles, including Working Class Conservatism in New York, Courting the Farm Vote on the Northern Plains, School Reform as Progressive Statecraft, and his book is coming out next year. The title of the book is The Revolution of 1928, Al Smith, American Progressivism and the Coming of the New Deal. Some of you may recall that Al Smith was the first Catholic candidate of a major party for President of the United States. In any case, after the talk, please feel free to ask questions, make comments, whatever, and otherwise just lean back and enjoy Rob Chiles. Rob?
Thank you all for being here. I'm very, very grateful and honored to have been invited back to speak at the center again this year, and I'm grateful to Dr. Pezda and to Professor Hernandez as well for their gracious hospitality. I was invited to speak to you this evening about the 1920s presidency, and I've taken for my theme tonight, as you can see, a complicated normalcy. I think, as a starting point, that the fact that your series this year, this fall, is the Roaring Twenties, I think that's a brilliant complement to last year's theme of the Gilded Age. It strikes me that the Roaring Twenties were the last hurrah for the Gilded Age order. We see a similarly dynamic economy. We see similar ethno-cultural clashes. We see similar maldistribution of the nation's similarly growing wealth, similar adherence to laissez-faire proscriptions against federal regulation of industry, similar devotion to high-tariff orthodoxy, similar lack of concern for the plight of farmers or immigrant industrial workers, a similar speculative stock bubble terminated by a similar, although much more spectacular, panic, crash, and depression. Most of the faces were new. Things were moving faster. They were on a much more ambitious scale. The music was a lot more fun. There were more cars. Women could vote. But there is a lot about the 20s that reminds us of the Gilded Age, including the presidents. The 1920s witnessed a triumvirate of conservative Republican presidents, the first of whom was swept into power on the promise of stepping away from progressive experimentation, and once that was largely achieved, the next two were retained in office with the promise of keeping up the new conservative status quo. Warren G. Harding, one of our major characters tonight, was elected promising the American people normalcy, a rejection of the experimentation and upheavals of the progressive era, and a return to a vague, idealized earlier order that looks a lot, at least on the surface, like Gilded Age America. Calvin Coolidge essentially sought to maintain the new conservative normalcy, which in culture meant a return of small-town Yankee Protestant cultural hegemony, and in economics meant the governmental smallness that came to be known as the New Era. And then there was the engineer of much of that new era. For the third of these presidencies, Herbert Hoover, who in the first two administrations served as Commerce Secretary, and he, when he finally ran on his own in 1928, ran with the pledge to, quote, go forward with the policies of the last 8 years. And so Harding reminds us of the bombastic Gilded Age small-town statesman. Coolidge was an echo of the post-Civil War Yankee Puritan politico, and Hoover evokes the rugged individualism of the 19th century West with a rags to riches story that seems like Horatio Alger set in a rural Western setting. On the other hand, you can't stop the world from turning. And the conservative normalcy of the 1920s never quite hushed growing dissent from disaffected ethnic minorities, from frustrated farmers, and from the increasingly restless urban working classes. No matter how much the politics of normalcy appealed to many Americans, and despite the landslide victories of Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, the presidents of the 1920s were compelled to contend with a series of complexities that made their age of normalcy quite complicated indeed. The first thing that you need to understand about the presidency in the 1920s was that it represented a purposeful rejection of what had come before the progressive era presidents, and especially this man, New Jersey Governor Woodrow Wilson. Wilson's quixotic quest for a League of Nations at the end of World War I had left him weakened, both politically and physically. He embarked on a speaking tour of the West to build support for the League of Nations Treaty, and he suffered a catastrophic stroke soon after this photograph was taken. It was not a good moment for such turmoil to take place in the White House. Economic convulsions were going on all around the country as post-war adjustment led to soaring inflation. By 1920, the cost of living was 105% higher than it had been before the war started. And a wave of strikes swept the nation in 1919, involving at least 4 million workers, including tens of thousands in major sectors like steel and soft coal. In Boston in 1919, there was the famous police strike when some police officers tried to form an American Federation of Labor Union. They were fired for doing so, and 90% of the Boston police went on strike as a result. Now, how do you run a city without a police force? The governor steps in. Because there's a fear after the Great War and after the rise of the USSR that any challenge to the old order is Bolshevism, and so the governor sends in the state militia to keep order in the streets of Boston. The commissioner fires most of the police, and the governor chews out the president of the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers, and says, quote, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." This catapulted a rather obscure Massachusetts governor to national prominence, and soon Calvin Coolidge would be nominated for the vice presidency. The fear of the outsider and the rabid anti-German sentiment that had been unleashed by the war provided the final push for the ongoing Prohibition movement. And so also right after the war, the 18th Amendment was ratified in January of 1919, and that October, over President Wilson's veto, the Volstead Act was passed by Congress, which provided for enforcement of Prohibition. And there were horrible race riots in Chicago and Omaha and Norfolk and Charleston and all around the country, leading to hundreds of deaths. And in the aftermath of the war, there was rampant fear of a mass influx of European refugees, and so Nativism was back on the rise once again. And in the summer of 1920, you started to hear whispers that the 1919 World Series had been fixed by gamblers, and by that fall, you have baseball stars getting indicted by a grand jury. And so the point is, everything seemed to be coming to pieces by 1920. And so you can start to understand why in 1920, a beleaguered American people would find so compelling the conservative normalcy promised by a handsome, if unremarkable, Ohio senator named Warren G. Harding. Harding was probably best noted for being easily manipulated by his fellow Senate Republicans. And one of his signature virtues was that he did not hold any particularly strong inclinations about much of anything. In one biographer's words, he was, quote, always more conspicuous for his senatorial appearance and easy manner than for anything he did or said on the floor. He had the effect on legislation of a comma or a semicolon. A couple of examples will have to suffice. On Prohibition, an issue fraught with political peril, Harding himself was known to imbibe, and in Ohio, he resisted the demands of the Anti-Saloon League, which had a special political power in the Buckeye State. He said he was for temperance but not prohibition. As the Senate considered the 18th Amendment, he added language that said, you're going to have to ratify it in 6 years or else you don't get it. He assumed that this would mean it would never get ratified by enough states. And so he could vote for the 18th Amendment while really being against it. Well, surprise, surprise, it ended up being ratified anyway, and so he became a supporter of the Volstead Act that fall. In his 1922 State of the Union speech, he was a prohibitionist. It was the law of the land. This is the rule of law. And so he came around to whatever the people wanted him to say. Harding took a similarly vague and profitable position when it came to women's suffrage. Here we see Harding with a group of suffrage activists in the summer of 1920. As you know, they would achieve nationwide victory later that summer with ratification of the 19th Amendment. Harding took a clever approach to this potentially perilous political issue. He withheld support from suffrage so long as it failed to gain support in Ohio, where there had been a series of failed referenda on women's suffrage. He constantly gave the answer that he was, quote, very earnest and thoughtful consideration about the issue, but he never actually said how he felt about it. But by the summer of 1920, when the writing was on the wall, he was in favor of women having the right to vote. And so here was a cunning, if mediocre, candidate for the presidency. Not someone who captured the imagination of the American public, but after 2 decades of swashbuckling progressives like Theodore Roosevelt or crusading idealists like Woodrow Wilson, Harding fulfilled Americans' appetite for a conservative, calm, stable peace. And of course, it didn't hurt at all that on the one major issue that people were riled up about, Harding came down on the right side with public opinion. He was firmly against the League of Nations. Harding had as his running mate Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge, a taciturn Yankee Congregationalist whose dour personality provided an ironic foil for the flamboyant and convivial Harding. Coolidge had humbled the labor movement. He had stemmed the suspected tide of radicalism in Boston, and so his appeal to the American people was obvious enough. For his part, Harding promised the American people that normalcy that they craved. Nobody knew with precision what normalcy actually meant, but they liked the sound of it. People liked what they heard from candidate Harding. A fatigued nation liked hearing that, quote, America's present need is not heroics but healing, not nostrums but normalcy, not revolution but restoration, not agitation but adjustment, not surgery but serenity, not the dramatic but the dispassionate, not experiment but equipoise, not submergence in internationality but sustainment in triumphant nationality. Say what you will about Harding, the man had mastered the art of the juxtaposition. He continued, it's one thing to battle successfully against the world's domination by a military autocracy, because the infinite God never intended such a program, but it's quite another thing to revise human nature and suspend the fundamental laws of life and all of life's requirements. In other words, enough tinkering, enough crusading. It's time to take a rest. It's time to take a breath. Harding's fellow Ohioan, Governor James Cox, seen here with his running mate, Assistant Navy Secretary Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Cox was the Democratic nominee. He tied himself to the League of Nations, and he made an infamous speech denouncing ethnic group opposition to the League and to Wilsonianism in general, infamously denouncing these so-called hyphenated Americans. This did not help the Democrats with ethnic urban dwellers who already were skeptical of the professorial Woodrow Wilson. Cox was unable to escape the shadow of the Great War, the League of Nations, of Wilson himself, and so Harding won in a landslide. Indeed, as in 1924, the Democrat would only win the so-called Solid South, where people were voting on sustained bitterness about the legacies of the Civil War and Reconstruction and continued devotion to white supremacy, rather than any particular interest in Wilson ideology. So now, Harding is President of the United States. So what sort of man was he? He is remembered today as something of a playboy because of ongoing, and they never seem to end, revelations about his private life. These salacious stories aside, he was also a musician. He was a band leader back home in Ohio. He was the product of the small-town Ohio world in which he had risen to prominence as a publisher in Marion, Ohio in the late 19th century. He had a soft spot for animals. From an early age, he could not abide seeing an animal suffer, and he deplored cruelty to animals. But first and foremost, Harding was a product of the politics of the Gilded Age, especially Gilded Age Ohio, one of the most important states in the politics of that period. He had emerged as the Republican leader in a Democratic county in a Republican state Senate district. He was able to thwart regional rivals and rise to statewide prominence, basically by not offending either of the two major Republican machines in Ohio, the Cincinnati-based organization of the Civil War veteran fire alarm Joe Foraker, or his rival, the Cleveland-based organization of the man who became known most famously as William McKinley's campaign manager, the Cleveland businessman and future Senator Mark Hanna. Harding was able to please both of them just enough to survive in Ohio politics. His speeches, too, were a reflection of the political world in which he was reared. To quote from his biographer, his conception of speech-making derived from the full-blown style current in his youth, when oratory was like a set fireworks piece and 4th of July orators filled the air with showers of rhetorical sparks and Roman candle phrases. Harding's speeches were meant to glow and expire. At the moment of their utterance, spoken so unhesitatingly by this virile neo-Roman in his silvery voice, they overwhelmed most of his hearers. One contemporary was more blunt, describing Harding's turgid oratory as, quote, an army of pompous phrases marching across the countryside in search of an idea. His style has been described as one of professional amiability, and it was remarked from early in his career that he looked like a senator. His heroes were Napoleon and Alexander Hamilton, and he was a die-hard Republican based largely on the classic party issues of the Gilded Age, adherence to the Union, high tariffs, and Republican prosperity. He was an admirer of the Maine senator and often corrupt politico James Blaine because of his party regularity, and he despised anybody who stepped out of the two-party system in the Gilded Age, whether it was the populists or mugwump good government reformers or greenbacks or anything like that. You had to stay within the narrow confines of the ideological battle between Democrats and Republicans, and that was that. He was an unsuccessful gubernatorial candidate in a really bad year for Republicans, 1910. And then he defeated Foraker for the Republican nomination for Senate in 1914, went off to Washington for the intentionally unremarkable tenure that I have already described. Along the way, he cultivated this image and this reputation in the manner of a moderate compromiser among Gilded Age politicos. As one biographer charitably remarked, even his weedy rhetoric had a purpose in its attempt by unanchored verbosity and a pleasant manner to reconcile the irreconcilable. He was then nominated for the presidency because, to quote again, he was everybody's second choice. Elected in a landslide repudiation of President Wilson, Harding came to office March 4, 1921, to deliver the promised change of direction and the return to normalcy, the word he hadn't coined, but we believe the phrase he had coined. Our supreme task, he said in his inaugural address, is the resumption of our onward normal way. Reconstruction, readjustment, restoration, all these must follow. I would like to hasten them. The first words of the perennially personally insecure Harding after his address were whispered. "Do you think," he asked, "do you think it was done all right?" Thus began the Harding years. If you want to know how the Harding presidency is generally remembered, I would offer to you this, perhaps the greatest opening sentence to a biography that I have ever encountered. Quote, "With better luck, Warren Gamaliel Harding might have gone down in history as another McKinley or Garfield, or at least the equivalent of a Pierce." I'll let that one sink in for a moment. Now, in fairness, Harding did have some achievements. He was a high tariff man, and the Republican Congress gladdened him with the Fordney-McCumber tariff of 1922, which on average raised tariff rates around 14%. And to his credit, Harding had at least given lip service to the fading but still historically significant Republican Party attachment to African American political rights in the South, best signified by his support for Missouri Congressman Leonidas Dyer's anti-lynching bill. Indeed, Harding gave a speech in 1921 in Birmingham, Alabama, that challenged the political inequality of the races. Quote, "I can say to you people of the South, both white and black, that the time has passed when you are entitled to assume that the problem of races is peculiarly and particularly your problem. It is the problem of democracy everywhere if we mean the things we say about democracy as the ideal political state. Whether you like it or not," he told his Birmingham, Alabama audience, "whether you like it or not, our democracy is a lie unless you stand for that equality." The African-American civil rights leader and NAACP founder W.E.B. Du Bois called these remarks a braver, clearer utterance than Theodore Roosevelt ever dared to make, or than William Taft or William McKinley ever dreamed of. The Ku Klux Klan was outraged, another feather in his cap. And they responded by trying to hurt his politics by spreading a false rumor that Harding was a member of the Klan. This was especially ironic because, in fact, throughout his career, he was also dogged by equally false rumors, also spread by bigots, that he was of partial black lineage. Harding also called on Congress to ban child labor, which had been deemed constitutionally protected by the Supreme Court a few years earlier. Yet none of these initiatives bore any real fruit. And Harding was far more assiduous and indeed far more successful in his work to pull the federal government back from the supposed excesses of Wilson and the other progressives. And he assembled a cabinet that was ideologically suited to such purposes. His Treasury Secretary was Andrew W. Mellon, a fabulously wealthy banker and aluminum baron, Mellon's solution to the post-war economy, known as the Mellon Plan, consisted of reducing the deficit by cutting government spending and simultaneously cutting taxes on the rich and on business. Therefore, the rich and the business will prosper and the economy will grow and everybody will be okay. In real terms, this meant revenue acts in 1921, 24, and especially his triumph in 1926. The top tax rate during the Great War had been 77% over $1 million. 1923, they cut that to 50%, and his great triumph in 1926 cut the top tax rate from 50% down to 20%. He pushed legislation to eliminate the excess profits tax. He unsuccessfully attempted to repeal the estate tax. But perhaps even more than Mellon, the most central figure to the Harding administration was Commerce Secretary Herbert Clark Hoover. Hoover represented another Gilded Age trope, the poor farm boy who rose in the world to become a great man, a sort of rural version of David Copperfield, which happened to be Hoover's favorite novel, also one of mine, actually. He was born in West Branch, Iowa, orphaned at the age of 9, moved west to Oregon to live with family. He was in the first graduating class from Stanford, became a very successful mining engineer, became a millionaire, became a government administrator during the World War, first of the Food Administration, and then after the war, he coordinated relief efforts for post-war Europe and earned the nickname the Great Humanitarian, as well as a reputation as a progressive. Once in power, however, Hoover shed any apparent progressive leanings he may once have held, and he set about consolidating power within the Commerce Department. Hoover's ambitions for his department have been described as almost imperial by some historians. He continually claimed powers that had once been the province of other bureaucrats. For example, he had a special interest, as you can imagine, in farm policy, and he was constantly butting heads with the Secretary of Agriculture, Henry C. Wallace, whose son Henry A. Wallace would have the same post under Franklin Roosevelt later on. Henry C. Wallace was probably the only true progressive in the Harding administration, and since farmers were suffering tremendously in the post-war economy, he was constantly pushing for more government intervention. Hoover saw this as an affront to the American system, and so he and Wallace constantly crossed swords. They called each other names. Wallace called Hoover stuffy and bloodless, and Hoover responded that Wallace was a dour Scotsman. Wallace died. He was finally out of the way, and Hoover basically took over farm policy, and he had much less contentious people at the Agriculture Department after that. Moreover, and perhaps even more significantly, Hoover expanded his reach in American life by claiming authority in new areas. The 1920s brought much new or recent technology to consumers, often for the first time. Two examples of Hoover's response, the way that he handled these changes in the economy and in society, give you an idea about the balance he tried to strike in American political life. One is air travel. In the beginning of the 1920s, air travel was prohibitively expensive, largely because air travel companies, airlines, these firms, their insurance was so expensive because the insurance companies, quite understandably, were afraid that the planes were going to crash and they were going to have to pay a lot of money in insurance. And so how do you handle this? Well, in some countries, they had the national government take over air travel, heavy regulation. Hoover doesn't want that. There is a role for the government, but it's sort of a junior partner role. What he had the federal government do is the Commerce Department started to inspect the plane to give enough assurance to the insurance companies that they would then have lower rates for insurance, and you could start to have cheaper tickets, and then a bigger scale, and by the end of the decade, the airline industry was poised to take off. They also gave an indirect subsidy to the airlines by privatizing airmail. And so you're then paying these fledgling companies to do government business, and that was also helpful to them. Another interesting example is the radio. Appropriately enough for our purposes, perhaps the first commercial radio broadcast in the United States were the results of the 1920 presidential election. Well, who owns the air? The people. The people own the air. Who speaks for the people? The government. And so the government, through the Commerce Department, of course, because it's Hoover, they have the power to bring some sort of order to the chaos. The airwaves in the early days of radio were just a cacophony of every little club. Department stores, as a way of selling radios, would have their own radio transmissions, or unions or churches. They all had radio. Well, this is just, as I said, a cacophony on the airwaves. We need to bring order to the chaos, and the way you do it is you don't do what they do in a lot of European countries and have the government control broadcasting and have government stations. Instead, what you do is you have the government give licenses to private outfits. And so it is Hoover, once again, who sets the trend that is with us more or less to this day. Other noteworthy members of the Harding administration include Laddie Boy, pictured here, a Toledo-born Airedale, who, according to the photo's caption, was acting as host for children in the absence of President and Mrs. Harding during the 1923 White House Easter egg roll. Laddie Boy has been referred to by the Smithsonian as the first celebrity White House pet. But regrettably, not all of the members of the Harding administration were heavyweights like Hoover, Mellon, Wallace, or Laddie Boy. Most were political hacks, a group of Harding's old cronies from back home, known collectively as the Ohio Gang. People like Charles Forbes, the head of the Bureau of Veterans Affairs, who embezzled money that was supposed to go to former soldiers. People like Thomas W. Miller, chair of the Office of Alien Property, who was consistently found to be taking bribes. Even the nation's chief law enforcer, Attorney General Harry Doherty, Harding's old crony from the Ohio legislature, who was known for selling contraband alcohol from his offices in Washington and had a series of ethics scandals until he was finally forced out by Harding's successor. On one level, the crude, amateurish corruption of the Ohio Gang reflected President Harding's notoriously poor judgment. His own father had once remarked that it was good that Warren hadn't been born a girl, quote, because you'd be in the family way all the time. You can't say no. Affably aloof though he often was, Harding himself probably hit the nail on the head, quote, I am not fit for this office and should never have been here, close quote. Indeed, these episodes reflected a real problem in the national administration, and the worst of it was seen in the infamous Teapot Dome scandal, in which Albert Fall, another member of the Ohio Gang, although he was not himself a Buckeye, he was from New Mexico, but I guess he was an honorary member, and he certainly earned the membership because as Secretary of the Interior, what he did was he pressured the Department of the Navy to transfer several naval oil reserve sites to his jurisdiction, and then he leased them on no-bid contracts for drilling by the Sinclair Oil Company. We found out why he was so enthusiastic to do this. It's because he had received all sorts of bribes and kickbacks from Sinclair Oil. Albert Fall would become the first former cabinet member to go to jail, and the rallying cry for the Democrats in the next election would be oil, 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 as we'll see it wasn't very effective. As Harding told the Kansas editor William Allen White, quote, "I have no trouble with my enemies. I can take care of my enemies all right. But my damned friends, White, they're the ones who keep me walking the floor at nights." Harding himself did not stick around to see how this was going to turn out, however. He had a massive heart attack on the evening of August 2nd, 1923, as his wife, Florence, was reading the Saturday Evening Post to him in their suite at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco. He was a mere 58 years old. By the time doctors arrived, he was already dead. Florence refused an autopsy and then swiftly had him embalmed, which, along with Harding's well-known dalliances, has fueled swirling rumors of an intramarital assassination. These are almost certainly false. Nevertheless, it is quite typical that the first member of the Harding administration to find out that the president was dead was Herbert Hoover, who was on top of everything. Just as revealing, Vice President Coolidge was back home in Vermont on vacation when this occurred. The last president to die in office had been William McKinley, and when he passed away, federal agents had to hunt down the new commander-in-chief, Theodore Roosevelt, on top of Mount Marcy in the Adirondack Mountains. Coolidge was a lot easier to catch up with, although just as hard to get in touch with, for his rustic family homestead in Vermont had neither electricity nor telephone. In a scene too Coolidge-like to have actually been contrived, he took the oath of office on August the 3rd at the family estate, delivered by his father, John Calvin Coolidge Sr., a local notary public. Coolidge is known, of course, as Silent Cal, and with good reason. There's a story, it's probably apocryphal, but it still gives us insight. And you probably know this story. He's at a dinner party, and there's a woman who finds out she's going to be sitting with President Coolidge, and her friend makes a bet with her. "I'll bet you can't get Silent Cal to say 3 words to you." And they're sitting at dinner, and Coolidge is quiet, and he's chewing very carefully. And the woman finally gets frustrated, and she says, "Mr. President, look, my friend, she bet me I couldn't get you to say 3 words." And he looked at her with his crescent moon smile, and he said, "You lose." It's probably apocryphal, but it's nevertheless, this notion has defined the public image of Calvin Coolidge for generations. Here you see Vanity Fair poking fun at the reticent former president in 1932. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt and the wife of the Speaker of the House, Nicholas Longworth, once remarked that Coolidge seemed as though he had been weaned on a pickle. Meanwhile, though, unlike Harding, who had no children, at least not by his wife, the Coolidges had 2 sons, John Calvin Coolidge III and Calvin Coolidge Jr., his younger boy seen here. Some people have argued that Coolidge, although always a man of few words and somewhat colorless, had been more dynamic and engaging earlier in his life until a tragedy struck the boy in Coolidge's first year as president. A few days, actually, after this photograph was taken, in June of 1924, Calvin Jr. got a staph infection on a blister on his foot. This is 4 years before penicillin was invented and a decade or more before it was actually introduced widely. So this proved catastrophic. The president's youngest boy succumbed to the infection on July 7th, 1924. And the president, by many reports, was never quite the same after this tragedy. Whatever the explanation, Calvin Coolidge's executive temperament provided a stark contrast to the dynamic Roosevelt, the crusading Wilson, or the bombastic backslapping Harding. Coolidge was purposeful, however, we have to take him seriously. He believed very firmly that the government needed to back off and that the president need not provide energetic leadership. The journalist Walter Lippmann had some fun with this. Quote, Mr. Coolidge's genius for inactivity is developed to a very high point. It is far from being an indolent inactivity. It is a grim, determined, alert inactivity, which keeps Mr. Coolidge occupied constantly. Nobody has ever worked harder at inactivity, with such force of character, with such unremitting attention to detail, with such conscientious devotion to the task. But Silent Cal did speak, and when he spoke the minds of many Americans. He tried to purge the most egregiously corrupt officials from the Harding years out of his cabinet. For example, Dougherty got the boot after the Attorney General was the subject of a second corruption investigation. But other ideas were retained. The pro-business, pro-growth, small government policies of Mellon and Hoover fit with many of Coolidge's notions. They were both retained. And indeed, the Coolidge approach to government fit with a lot of the social attitudes of the day. The culture of the 20s was not just about speakeasies and flappers and jazz. It was also about the unbridled veneration of the businessman. There was a best-selling book in the mid-1920s entitled The Man Nobody Knows, in which Bruce Barton compares Jesus Christ to the world's greatest businessman. And he thinks that's a compliment to Jesus. We might find that blasphemous. At the time, it was a bestseller. Coolidge was part of this idea as well. His own words were thus: the man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there. That's one side of the politics of the time. Another is this. Nativism was on the rise domestically in the 1920s. After the Great War, as I said earlier, there was a fear, as you can see, that Europe would once again come flooding over the shores into America. And so in 1921, they passed the Emergency Quota Act, which said we need to basically freeze the demographic balance of the United States. We're going to look at the 1910 census, and every country is going to get a quota for immigrants each year based on 3% of their share of the population at the previous census. So we don't want too many Southern and Eastern Europeans. That's who they're really afraid of. In 1924, they decided, okay, that law is outdated. We need a better law. They switched it from a 3% quota to a 2% quota, so they reduced, and they said, we need to use a different census. Well, that makes sense to us, right? Now they've had a 1920 census. No, that's not what we mean. We mean the 1890 census. Now, if you were here last year, and I recognize some of your faces, and I'm gratified by that, then you know that millions of these Jewish and Catholic, Russian and Polish and Italian and Southern and Eastern Europeans, they came after the 1890 census. So the point is not to freeze America, it's to turn back the clock to an age of Northern and Western European, Protestant European dominance of this country. This was not a partisan issue. 75% of all Republicans in the House of Representatives voted aye. 75% of all Democrats in the House of Representatives voted aye. The only real difference is geography, as you can see on this map. The Northeast, the Midwest, slightly less enthusiastic about this. If you're wondering about North Dakota, high population of German and Central and Northern European immigrant homesteaders there. But really, it was New York Metro, New England. That's where a lot of these immigrants are, and that's where a lot of the no votes are coming from. And this was only a part of the larger wave of reaction in the US in the post-war years. The most notable and offensive aspect of this phenomenon is probably the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. They had gone out of business after Reconstruction, good riddance, but now they're back. In the South, this new Klan was akin to the old. Their obsession remained African Americans and the maintenance of white supremacy. And even outside of the South, there was plenty of racism, to be sure. But this time, the Klan was expanding its horizons. They had other interests as well. The new Klan drew a great deal of strength outside of the South, especially in the West. State of Oregon, they had a great deal of power. You can see it here. In Indiana and throughout the Midwest, but especially Indiana, they had a great deal of political power. And so now they were focused not just on white supremacy, but also nativism, anti-immigrant. They were militantly anti-Semitic. Throughout the 20s, they had a particular obsession with being anti-Catholic. In the 1920s, they gained a great deal of political strength as well and became a factor in our story. Charles Culberson was a Democratic senator from Texas. He had served since 1898. In 1922, he spoke out against the Klan. He got primaried and lost. The governor of Oklahoma tried to fight the power of the Klan, and he got impeached. In 1924, the Klan took over the Indiana Republican Party, and they elected one of their own, Edward L. Jackson, governor. That same year, there were upwards of 6 million members of the Ku Klux Klan nationwide. And that year, they also infected the nation's presidential politics. At the 1924 Democratic National Convention, representatives of the big cities of the Northeast and the Midwest, led by the Democratic governor of New York, Alfred E. Smith, and other urban Northeasterners, waged a fierce, if unsuccessful, battle to try and shift the direction of the Democratic Party away from domination by the Solid South and toward a more pluralistic understanding of the nation by trying to thwart the presidential ambitions of William Gibbs McAdoo, a very unsubtle ally in some ways of the Klan. He's not a Klansman, but he's not an enemy. They tried to thwart him, and they tried to have the Democratic Party have a part of their platform that rebuked the Klan by name. And this was a major controversy. While McAdoo, the son-in-law and Treasury Secretary of Woodrow Wilson, was considered the frontrunner, Al Smith enjoyed the benefit of home court for the 1924 contest, which was being held at Madison Square Garden. Seeking to exaggerate this advantage, Smith's Tammany Hall allies packed the rafters with their constituents whose bawdy taunts of the speakers and constant bickering with the delegates transformed the proceedings into a sort of burlesque of the decade's culture wars. Sectional antagonisms raged, especially over the issue of the Klan. A senator from Oklahoma said that a large number of Klansmen had, quote, joined the order to protect the Constitution and the law, and he was hissed by the crowd. When a delegate from Georgia called on his fellow Southerners to stand up against the Klan, he was jeered by his fellow Southerners. He was not jeered, however, by representatives from 23 northern states who paraded toward the speaker to try and congratulate him into the Georgia delegation. The Tammany Hall paid band, as this was going on, started playing the popular General William Tecumseh Sherman tribute, Marching Through Georgia. There was an angry letter in the Times the next day from the Georgia delegation. There were fistfights on the floor. A judge from Ohio got shouted down while he was speaking, and the crowd laughed mockingly at the governor of North Carolina. The proposal to denounce the Klan, meanwhile, was rejected by a single vote out of over 1,000 cast. Even a 3-time presidential nominee was not immune from this infectious disrespect. In the midst of the chaos, William Jennings Bryan had gone to the podium, and he was met, in the words of the New York Times, with such a storm of hisses and booing that it was impossible for him to make himself heard. He reprimanded these city dwellers in the gallery that they would never be, in his words, they would never be the leaders of a noble cause. And so everything was falling apart for the Democrats. After 103 rounds of voting, the party finally settled on a compromise nominee whose chief virtue was that he was mediocre. John W. Davis was a corporate lawyer, former West Virginia politician. His running mate was Charles W. Bryan, the great commoner's baby brother. The Democrats limped out of the convention, bitterly divided, and went down to ignominious defeat that November. The one bright spot for the Democrats was the return of their 1920 vice presidential nominee, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had been sidelined with a mysterious illness and made his first major speech back to the crowd in 1924, nominating his fellow New Yorker, Alfred E. Smith, for president, calling him famously the happy warrior of the political battlefield. And it was the one speech that everybody actually cheered. The Democrats had nominated an underwhelming compromise candidate who is remembered in history mostly as probably the last conservative the Democrats ever nominated. But there was, in fact, going to be a significant challenge to Coolidge in 1924 from the left. And it came in the form of the last hurrah of one of the old progressives, Wisconsin's Fighting Bob La Follette. The Wisconsin senator was no longer an upstart reformist governor. He was a nationally known progressive leader with a large and faithful national following. He still had the fire, and so in 1924 he said enough was enough from what he saw as favoritism toward corporations and against farmers and workers, and he ran for president as a third-party candidate. He called for government operation of railroads and of mines, an end to the Mellon Plan, protections for unions against court-ordered anti-strike injunctions. He called for changing the tariff rates, help for farmers. He wanted to take on the courts. On the campaign trail, especially in the Midwestern farm states, which were, as I said, suffering tremendously throughout the 20s, there's no Roaring Twenties for farmers. And the crowds thrilled and cheered to Fighting Bob, but the enthusiasm was misleading. La Follette carried only his home state. Coolidge was reelected in a landslide, and within a year, Fighting Bob was dead. Coolidge himself came from a bucolic background in rural Vermont, but as La Follette had intimated on the campaign trail, this administration was not especially sympathetic to the American farmer. As I've said, for farmers, the Depression started soon after World War I. And in their desperation, the farmers and their motley and often contradictory, as you see here, lobbying outfits, flailingly called for various reform schemes, eventually gravitating towards something called the Mcnary-Hagen program, a complex tariff readjustment scheme that I'm not going to bore you with the details of. But this program was bought into by a lot of farmers. It was rejected twice by presidential veto. It was viewed by Coolidge and especially by Hoover, who by this time was dominating farm policy from the Commerce Department. It was viewed as a governmental overreach that flew in the face not only of the president's small government ideas, but also of the Commerce Secretary's vision of rugged individualism. As one historian has noted, Hoover feared for the souls of farmers if the government intervened too much on their behalf. Aside from farmers, however, and a few other groups like coal miners, railroad workers, and especially textile workers in New England, where there was an ongoing business depression, aside from these weak spots, this was a generally robust economy. Gross national product improved 40% from 1919 to 1929. And these three men were often given much of the credit because of their prudent management of government affairs, their revival of laissez-faire, lower taxes, and higher tariffs. This formula remains popular. Many conservatives to this day remain very fond of Calvin Coolidge. And when Ronald Reagan moved into the White House in 1981, it is telling that he had this portrait of Calvin Coolidge conspicuously displayed in his new home. On the other hand, it is worth inquiring how much of this was about politicians versus other factors like innovation. Of the two major characters in this photograph, it's quite possible that the car had a bigger influence on the economy than the president. From 1919 to 1929, productivity increased 40% in industry, 26% in agriculture because of entrepreneurs and innovations. There have been 1.5 million cars produced in 1920. There were 5 million a year by the late 1920s. By 1930, there were 122 airlines operating 50,000 miles of routes, an industry that basically didn't exist at the beginning of the decade. In 1922, 100,000 radios had been sold. By 1929, radio sales were 4.5 million per year. By the end of the decade, 68% of American households had been electrified, and on Wall Street, power stocks soared. You can credit this to the prudent administration of Coolidge. You can credit this to private enterprise. You can credit this to a combination of factors. There are historians who come down on all sides. But it's worth considering all of these factors, is my only point. And whatever the explanation, this was a time of broad, although not universal, prosperity and of patriotic pride. Between the Coolidge economy and Lindbergh's 1927 transatlantic triumph, Americans were feeling more and more confident, more and more patriotic, prouder and prouder. And for most of his time in office, it was speculated that the popular and sensible and competent Silent Cal might seek a second full term. These expectations were dashed when, on August 2nd, 1927, President Coolidge emerged from his cabin while vacationing in the Black Hills and handed strips of paper to the waiting press corps. When they opened them, there was a surprise. They read simply, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. After this excessively Coolidge-like announcement, Commerce Secretary Hoover was the clear successor. Hoover was strongly disliked in the farm regions, but to many Americans, Coolidge prosperity was Hoover prosperity. Indeed, Hoover ran for president calling for the continuation of the status quo. As he began his campaign for the White House, he hoisted the banner of Harding-Coolidge prosperity, promising that if elected, he would, quote, go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, and if given this chance, Republican economics would ensure that, quote, poverty will be banished from this nation. Indeed, at one time, Hoover had called for some restrictions on the powerful, some regulations on business practices, but over the course of the 1920s, it became increasingly evident that that previous progressivism had been pushed aside. And so by 1928, Hoover appeared less like an old-fashioned progressive Republican from earlier in the century and more in the journalist H.L. Mencken's characteristically cruel but effective phrase, like a fat Coolidge. He had an opponent, however, and that was the 4-term Democratic governor of New York State, Alfred E. Smith. Smith had been one of the only Democrats around the country to survive the 1924 party debacle. He had been reelected over a formidable candidate, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. And he had, in the words of the syndicated columnist Mark Sullivan, emerged from the Democratic wreck stronger than ever. In many ways, Al Smith was the anti-Hoover. He was a grandson of Irish immigrants, a Roman Catholic, a product of New York's Lower East Side and of the Tammany Hall political machine. In many ways, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, as I said, represented the logical political extensions of various Gilded Age tropes involving Anglo-Saxon rural Republican America. And in the same way, Al Smith represented the political fructification of a life that began in the Gilded Age city. He reflected that world in both his personality and in his program. He was, as I said, an unashamed Catholic. He openly opposed and even flouted Prohibition. He spoke with a Bowery brogue. He sported a brown derby. He made his campaign theme song the sidewalks of New York. He opposed the immigration quotas of 1924 as discriminatory. He rhetorically bludgeoned the Ku Klux Klan in a series of speeches, and he called for a reworking of the Volstead Act. Smith's candidacy was, of course, offensive to the Klan and to the millions of other Americans who did not see a Catholic from New York City as their ideal of what they were striving for at this decade, which was 100% Americanism. When his campaign train entered into Oklahoma, it was greeted by burning crosses. Smith and his campaign fought back. That night in Oklahoma City, he delivered a very famous speech denouncing such bigotry and denouncing the idea that anybody could be 100% American and calling for a more pluralistic understanding of our country. His surrogates did the same thing. The colorful New York City mayor, Jimmy Walker, made his way across the river to Newark, and he gave a speech invoking the tomb of the unknown soldier and reminding his audience that, quote, no one knew what color he was, and no one knew where he went to church. While in Boston, the once and future mayor, James Michael Curley, displayed a poster at his Democratic Party headquarters with an image of the monument and the sardonic caption, "What a tragedy if we should learn he was a Jew, Catholic, or a Negro." Moreover, Al Smith presented a meaningful appeal to the many Americans who felt they had been left behind by the Coolidge-Hoover economy. His program in New York in the 1920s had represented, in one historian's words, an island of progressivism in an ocean of normalcy. He had, in an age when everybody was pulling back from progressive reforms, instituted initiatives for hospital construction, public health nursing services, child welfare programs, a 9-fold increase in public school spending, investment in dozens of new state parks, conservation initiatives, reforestation initiatives, a 48-hour work week for women, all sorts of things. In 1928, Smith proposed to make this particular style of progressivism with a 3-fold focus on social welfare, on labor protections and reforms, and on cultural pluralism. This unique version of progressivism, he proposed to make this a national agenda, and in defeat, not to spoil the surprise for you, this did become the Democratic Party's national agenda moving forward, even though he was roundly defeated. But in the meantime, the agenda had a particular appeal to the recent immigrant working classes in the Northeast and in the Midwest who didn't necessarily feel like they fit in with Coolidge's America and who had been pushed away from Wilson's America too, and certainly Cox's America. They certainly weren't part of William Jennings Bryan's America. This is the first time that they find someone who speaks to them both on cultural pluralism, which we know about. They don't like prohibition, they don't like immigration restriction, but also on their economic lives, which is something historians have long ignored, and I think we would do well to pay attention to. As a result, even though Smith got trounced, he won 2 staunchly Republican states that year, Massachusetts and Rhode Island, where the economy had tanked and where there were a lot of recent immigrant voters. But for an overwhelming majority of Americans, there was no reason for such a change, and Hoover was indeed elected in a landslide. Smith lost his home state, and he struggled even to hold on to the solid South, which was sundered in 1928. Hoover won the popular vote by 18 points and racked up a 444 vote total in the Electoral College. The 1920s presidency, in other words, had been affirmed at the polls by the American people in 1928. The man who had engineered so much of that new era was now safely ensconced in the White House, while those who questioned both the cultural and the economic implications of the Republican presidencies had been roundly repudiated. Everything had fallen into place. It was time for self-congratulation. It was time for self-confidence, or as the Greeks would call it, hubris. Less than a year after Hoover's triumph, just like in each of the Gilded Age bubbles, it burst, and it all came crashing down. But that's a story for another lecture on another night at another time. Thank you very much.